3 weeks ago, I gave my daughter my name, choosing motherhood over biology. That night, my father texted the group, "Heirs only, no dead ends, don't bring your daughter." I declined the invite. He called it a relief, yet tonight, at the city's finest restaurant, he froze. His so-called dead end was sitting opposite the one person who could dismantle his legacy, holding a red-stamped truth far sharper than any insult. My name is Lydia Ward. After the decree, the ink dried on the final adoption decree. It was a document that carried more weight than my birth certificate ever did. It stated that Harper, a 7-year-old girl with eyes that held too much history and a heart that needed a fortress, was legally mine. The process had not been a cinematic courtroom drama. It was a marathon of background checks, home visits, and a quiet, suffocating patience that cost me more sleep than any corporate litigation I had ever managed. But we won. We were a family on paper, in spirit, and in law. I thought that would be enough to force the world to respect the shape of us. I was wrong. The phone buzzed against the hardwood of my nightstand at exactly 11:18 at night. The screen glowed with a group message notification. The sender was Graham Ward, my father. The subject line was his birthday dinner. The preview text was short, brutal, and devoid of any paternal warmth. Heirs only, no dead ends. Do not bring your daughter. I stared at the words until they blurred. He did not say Harper. He did not say your child. He said dead ends. In the lexicon of the Ward family, a dead end was a branch of the family tree that failed to produce a bloodline successor to carry the Ward Harbor Logistics name. I was the dead end. Harper was the proof of my failure to launch. I did not argue. I did not type out a paragraph defending the validity of my motherhood. I did not beg for a seat at the table where I had spent 30 years trying to earn the right to hold a fork. I typed 4 words, "I am not coming." The bubble appeared immediately. Graham was waiting. He was ready to cut. Good. Do not ruin the party with your existence. I set the phone down face down. The silence in the house was heavy. I walked to the door of Harper's room and pushed it open just an inch. She was asleep, one arm thrown over her head, the other clutching a worn plush rabbit that had lost one ear. She looked peaceful. She looked permanent. And in that moment, the hurt that had been pooling in my chest evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. This was not about being disliked. Every family has friction. Every family has a black sheep. This was different. This was erasure. My father was not just uninviting us. He was trying to edit us out of the narrative. He wanted a birthday dinner that reflected the fantasy of his dynasty. A table where every face mirrored his own, and every future promised a direct genetic line. Harper and I were the glitches in his code. I closed the door without making a sound. I walked to the kitchen, the linoleum cold under my bare feet, and I dialed a number I knew by heart. It was late, but Maris Cole never slept when there was a crisis to be managed or a strategy to be deployed. Maris was the woman who had pulled me out of the darkest depression of my 20s, the mentor who taught me that tears were fine, but strategy was better. She picked up on the second ring. I told her everything. I read the texts aloud. My voice did not shake. I felt like I was reading a deposition for a case I was about to win. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear the click of a lighter and the exhale of smoke. Maris did not offer sympathy. She did not tell me my father was a monster, even though we both knew the truth. She gave me an order. Go. I started to protest. Go. She repeated, but do not beg. I understood. Begging was showing up uninvited and making a scene. Begging was demanding love from a man who only understood leverage. I needed to change the currency of the transaction. Graham Ward did not respect emotion. He respected power. He respected the ability to be in the room when decisions were made. I hung up the phone and opened my laptop. The screen was stark white in the dark kitchen. I navigated to the reservation portal for the Lark and Ledger. It was the most exclusive restaurant in the city, the kind of place where the maitre d' knew your net worth before he took your coat. It was the place where Graham held court, where he liked to be seen, where every table was a stage. I did not book the table under the name Lydia Ward. the disappointed daughter. I did not book it as a family member hoping to squeeze in a chair. I booked a table for two. I used my corporate credentials. I used the weight of my position at the Northbridge Contract Integrity Office. I requested the table by the window, the one directly across from the center banquette where the wards always sat. I requested it for business purposes. I added a note about the high-profile nature of the meeting. The confirmation email arrived 3 minutes later. Your table is reserved. I sat back in the chair. My father wanted a dinner with no dead ends. He wanted a night where he could pretend his legacy was flawless. He wanted to sit with his sons and toast to the empire he believed he had built on solid ground. He had no idea that the ground was already shifting. I was going to that dinner. I was not going to scream. I was not going to throw wine. I was not going to demand an apology for the way he treated Harper. I was simply going to exist. I was going to sit in his line of sight, at a table that required more clout to book than he thought I possessed, with a guest he could not ignore, and a file that contained the one thing he feared more than a dead end: the truth. I looked at the time. It was midnight. The birthday had officially begun. I closed my laptop. I had less than 24 hours to prepare. I needed a suit that looked like armor. I needed a face that showed zero weakness. And most of all, I needed to make sure that when Graham Ward looked up from his appetizers and saw me, he understood that he had made a fatal calculation error. He thought he had uninvited a daughter. He was about to find out he had summoned an auditor. I went back to check on Harper one last time. She shifted in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. I whispered a promise to the dark room. I promised her that she would never have to beg for a seat at anyone's table. I would build her own table. And tonight, I was going to clear the ground for it. The game was set. The invitation was declined, but the appointment was confirmed. To understand why a father would call his own daughter a dead end, you have to understand the theology of the Ward household. We did not go to church on Sundays. We went to the dining room table every night at 6 sharp. That table was the altar, and the family name was the hymn we were forced to sing until our throats were raw. In the Gospel according to Graham Ward, the world was divided into 2 categories of people. There were the ones who carried the name forward, and there were the ones who were merely keeping the seat warm until a better option arrived. My father owns Ward Harbor Logistics. It is a mid-sized operation, the kind of company that moves shipping containers from point A to point B without asking too many questions about what is inside. It is not an empire. It is a solid, unglamorous business that smells like diesel and salt water. But if you listen to Graham talk, you would think he was a titan of industry. He loved to stand next to powerful men, council members, zoning commissioners, guys with union connections, because he believed that if he stood close enough, their shadow would make him look bigger. He curated his life to look like a dynasty, and a dynasty requires a king and a prince. That was where my brothers came in. Cameron was the firstborn. He was the heir apparent, the golden calf. He was mediocre in school, lazy in sports, and had the charisma of a damp towel. But none of that mattered. He had the right chromosomes. He was the vessel for the legacy. Ethan came 3 years later. He was the spare, the backup plan in case Cameron drove his car off a bridge or decided to move to an ashram. Ethan was softer, anxious, always looking at Graham like a dog waiting to be kicked. But he was still a son. He still counted. And then there was me, Lydia, the third child, the girl. I was the punctuation mark at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to read. I was there to complete the set, to make the Christmas card look full. But I was never part of the strategy. I realized my position in the hierarchy when I was 16 years old. I had spent the summer bussing tables at a diner on the edge of town, smelling like grease and maple syrup, saving every single dime in a shoebox under my bed. I needed a car. Cameron had been given a brand new truck for his 16th birthday, a reward for getting a C average. I knew better than to ask for that. I bought a beat-up sedan with rust around the wheel wells and an engine that sounded like a coughing smoker. I drove it home, proud of the independence I had bought with my own sweat. I parked it in the driveway and waited for Graham to come out. He walked around the car. kicked the tire once, and looked at me with a flat, unimpressed expression. He told me it was good that I was learning the value of $1 because he needed to save his liquidity for Cameron's tuition. That was the moment the illusion shattered. I thought my independence would earn his respect. I thought if I showed him I was tough, smart, and capable, he would see me as a ward, but he did not see grit. He just saw a line item he could delete from his ledger. My self-reliance did not make him proud. It just made me cheap to keep. Over the years, the dynamic calcified. I graduated top of my class. I secured scholarships. I climbed corporate ladders in companies that had nothing to do with him. I built a reputation in compliance and contract law. But every time I came home for Sunday dinner, hoping to share a win, the conversation was hijacked before the appetizers were even cleared. I would start to say that I had been promoted or that I had landed a massive audit contract. Graham would nod, his eyes already drifting to the other end of the table. Then he would interrupt. He would ask Cameron what he was doing for the company. He would ask Cameron about the unions or the fuel surcharges. It did not matter that Cameron's answer was usually a mumble about delegating the work to someone else. The spotlight was fixed. One evening, I pushed back. I was 25. I asked him why he never asked about my work. I asked him why my career was treated like a hobby while Cameron's failures were treated like stepping stones. Graham set his fork down. He looked at me with that terrifying calmness he used when he was negotiating a rate cut. He told me that a strong bloodline is a line that has a successor. He said that what I did was fine for me, but what Cameron did was for the name. He said the word heir like it was a holy title, in his mind. Succession was not about competence. It was not about who was smartest or who worked the hardest. It was a biological mandate. You either had the equipment to carry the name, or you were just passing through. The family photos were the worst. We took them every year for the company holiday card. The photographer, usually a guy Graham hired because he owed him a favor, would always arrange us the same way. Graham in the middle, sitting in the big leather chair, Cameron standing on his right hand, a hand on the back of the chair, Ethan on the left, the three men, the phalanx of ward power. And me? I was always directed to stand a little to the side, or to sit on the armrest, or to lean in from the back. I was visual clutter. When the cards were printed, I was often cropped so severely that only my shoulder or half my face made it into the frame. I was the ghost in the machine. I was the accessory that distracted from the main event. I learned to stop trying to force my way into the center of the frame. I learned that my value to Graham Ward was entirely theoretical. It was based on a single potential utility. Could I marry a man with enough influence to help the business? Or more importantly, could I produce a grandson who could be a backup to the backup? That was the only currency I had, my womb, my biology. If I could not run the company, I could at least breed someone who might, and then I brought Harper home. Harper was not a strategic alliance. She was not the result of a marriage to a senator or a shipping magnate. She was a little girl with a messy past who needed a mother, and I was a woman with a surplus of love and nowhere to put it. She did not share my DNA. She did not have the Ward nose or the Ward chin. When I told my father I was fostering her with the intent to adopt, he looked at me as if I had told him I was burning down the warehouse. He asked me why I would take on someone else's problem. He asked me what the point was if she was not ours. He looked at this beautiful, fragile child and saw a broken link in a chain he worshipped. To Graham, adoption was not charity or love. It was a betrayal. It was a public declaration that I was opting out of his biological imperative. By choosing a child who did not share his blood, I was sealing off the only avenue I had to be useful to him. I was turning myself into a dead end on purpose. That was when the invitations started to dry up. That was when the phone calls became shorter. I was no longer just the daughter who did not matter. I was the daughter who had actively sabotaged the brand. I had become a waste of resources. So when he sent that text message 3 weeks ago, telling me that heirs only were welcome, it was not a sudden snap. It was the final verdict of a trial that had been going on since I was 16 years old. He looked at my life, at the home I built, at the child I saved, and he saw nothing. He saw a branch that needed to be pruned so the rest of the tree could thrive. He thought he was cutting off a dead limb. He did not realize he was severing the only root that was actually holding him up. Tonight, at the Lark and Ledger, I was going to show him exactly what happens when you underestimate the part of the family you forgot to fear. Harper did not arrive on my doorstep in a woven basket with a note pinned to a blanket. She arrived via a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning from a social worker who sounded like she had been awake for 3 days straight. It was a crisis placement. It involved a cascade of adult failures, addiction, neglect, and a biological family tree that had rotted from the inside out. Harper was 5 years old then, and she was not looking for a savior. She was looking for a corner to hide in where the shouting did not reach. I was the only person in the peripheral contact list who picked up the phone and said yes without asking how long it would take. That yes started a clock I did not know was ticking. The transition from emergency foster placement to adoption is not a montage of ice cream cones and playground laughter. It is a forensic audit of your entire existence. The state does not hand over children easily, and they should not. They want to know who you are, how you earn your money, and, most critically, who will catch you if you fall. They call it the support network. They want to see a village. I was single. I was a woman working 60 hours a week auditing corporate contracts. My village was supposed to be the Ward family. This was where the trap snapped shut. To finalize the adoption, I needed character references and a statement of family support. The caseworker, a woman named Mrs. Higgins who had eyes like laser beams, explicitly asked about my father. She saw the name Graham Ward and the logistics company. She saw stability. She saw resources. She told me that having the patriarch of such a prominent local family vouch for me would fast-track the stability assessment. So I went to Graham. I remember standing in his study, the air smelling of lemon polish and expensive scotch. I laid the papers on his mahogany desk. It was a simple affidavit. It stated that the extended family was aware of the adoption and was supportive of the placement. It was a lie. Of course, Graham did not support it, but I needed his signature more than I needed his love. He picked up his fountain pen, the heavy black one with the gold nib, and he looked at me. He did not read the document. He knew what it was. He knew that without this piece of paper, the state might look at my single status and my demanding job and decide Harper was better off elsewhere. He held my motherhood hostage between his thumb and forefinger. He told me he would sign it, but he had terms. He said that if he was going to put his name on this mess, I had to ensure it remained invisible. He told me that he did not want to hear about behavioral issues. He did not want to see toys in his living room during the holidays. He did not want his business associates asking why his daughter was raising a child that clearly did not come from the Ward line. He signed the paper with a flourish. Then he pushed it across the desk and told me to keep my project quiet. I took the deal. I took it because Harper was sleeping in my guest room with a nightlight on, terrified of the dark, and I would have signed a deal with the devil himself to keep her safe. For 2 years, I paid the price of that signature. I became a ghost in my own family. When we were summoned for mandatory Sunday dinners or holiday gatherings, Harper and I were treated like unauthorized personnel. Graham never set a place for us at the main table. We were relegated to the small folding table near the kitchen door, the spot usually reserved for overflow guests or children who had not yet learned table manners. I sat there, cutting Harper's chicken, while 20 feet away, Graham held court with Cameron and Ethan. I listened to them discuss the future of the company, the expansion of the shipping lanes, and the legacy of the Ward name. I watched Cameron make jokes about my little charity case loud enough for me to hear. Waiting for a reaction I refused to give. I swallowed every insult. When Graham introduced us to new business partners, he would gesture vaguely in my direction and say, "This is Lydia. She is currently figuring things out." He never said I was a senior auditor. He never said I was a mother. He framed me as a transient failure, and he framed Harper as the luggage I was dragging around. There was one evening, about 6 months into the placement, when Harper drew a picture of the family. She included Graham. She drew him tall and angry, with big eyebrows. She walked up to him after dinner, her small hand trembling, and held it out. Graham looked down at her, He did not take the paper. He did not smile. He just turned his back and asked Ethan to pour him another drink. I saw the light go out in Harper's eyes. I saw her lower the paper and retreat behind my legs. That night, I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table and shatter his precious crystal decanters. But I froze. I thought about the social worker. I thought about the upcoming home visit. I thought about how easy it would be for Graham to make a phone call and say that he had concerns about my stability. So I picked up Harper. I told her the drawing was beautiful, and we left. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, hating myself for my cowardice. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that once the judge banged the gavel and the papers were sealed, I could stop bowing. I thought the adoption decree would be a shield. I was naive. When the final approval came through 3 weeks ago, I felt a weight lift off my chest that I had been carrying for 730 days. I was legally Harper's mother. The state was satisfied. The village had been verified. I foolishly thought this changed the equation with my father. I was wrong. The day after the court finalized the adoption, I saw Graham. I expected nothing. Maybe a nod. Instead, he looked at me with a cold, predatory amusement. He told me that just because the state gave me a piece of paper did not mean I had changed anything that mattered. He told me to remember my position. He said that now that the drama was over, I should focus on not being an embarrassment. He still thought he held the leash. He thought that because I had submitted for 2 years, I was broken. He thought my silence was permanent. Then the text message came. Heirs only. It was not just an exclusion. It was a reminder of the caste system he had built. He was telling me that in the eyes of the Ward family, the law did not matter. Biology was the only law he recognized. He was telling me that Harper would never be a granddaughter. She would always be a mistake he tolerated as long as she remained invisible. I looked at that phone screen, and I saw the future. I saw Harper at 10 years old, wondering why she was not invited to Christmas. I saw her at 15, realizing that her grandfather looked at her like she was a stain on the carpet. I saw her learning the most dangerous lesson a child can learn, that she had to apologize for occupying space. If I stayed home, if I accepted his terms one more time, I would be teaching her that our dignity was negotiable. I would be teaching her that love was something you had to beg for from people who held power over you. I could not do that. The fear that had silenced me for 2 years evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I was done protecting Graham's image. I was done pretending that his signature on a support affidavit meant he owned me. I had played the submissive daughter to secure my child's future. But the transaction was complete. I had the decree. I had the rights. And now, I had something else. I had a reservation. I realized that night that I was not going to the birthday dinner to celebrate my father. I was going to introduce him to the daughter he had never bothered to meet, not the one who begged for signatures in his study, but the one who hunted down discrepancies in million-dollar contracts for a living. He wanted heirs only? Fine. He was about to find out that inheritance is not just about blood. It is about who has the strength to take the throne. I was done waiting for a seat. I was bringing my own chair. I have a habit that I developed in my early 20s, right around the time I started realizing that my last name was a loan I could never repay. When I am terrified, I clean. I do not just tidy up. I sterilize. I scrub the grout until my knuckles ache. I polish the stainless steel until it reflects a distorted, terrified version of my face. It is a way of imposing order on a world that feels like it is spinning off its axis. If I can control the bacteria on the kitchen island, maybe I can control the fact that my family treats me like a biological error. So, at 2 a.m. on the day of my father's birthday, I was standing in my kitchen, smelling of bleach and lemon zest, aggressively wiping down a counter that was already clean. The house was silent, or so I thought. Then I heard the creak of a floorboard. I turned around, my heart hammering against my ribs. Harper was standing in the doorway. She was wearing her oversized t-shirt with the faded cartoon cat on it, rubbing one eye with the back of her hand. She looked small, She looked entirely too innocent for the war zone I was about to drag her into. She asked me a question that stopped my hands mid-motion. She asked me what a dead end was. The sponge fell from my hand into the sink with a wet slap. I stared at her. I asked her where she had heard that phrase. She shrugged. A small, sleepy movement. She told me she heard Uncle Cameron say it on the phone when we were at the house last Christmas. She said he told someone that the family tree had a dead end. She looked at me with those wide, discerning eyes and asked if we were the dead end because we lived on a cul-de-sac. The air left my lungs. Cameron, of course. It was not enough to mock me in boardrooms. He had to say it within earshot of a 5-year-old child, casually reducing her existence to a navigational hazard. He had probably said it while laughing, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, completely unaware that children absorb poison just as easily as they absorb love. I could have told her the truth. I could have told her that a dead end is what mean men call women who do not give them what they want. I could have told her it is a slur for a daughter who chooses her own family, but I looked at her face, open and trusting, and I could not break her. Not yet. I knelt down on the cold tile so I was eye level with her. I smoothed the hair back from her forehead. My hands were trembling. But I kept my voice steady. I told her that a dead end is not a bad thing. I told her that a dead end is just a place where the old road stops so a new, better road can be built. It is where you turn around because the path you were on was not going anywhere good. She seemed to consider this. She nodded, satisfied with the logic, and padded back to her room. When she was gone, I gripped the edge of the counter until my fingers turned white. I was lying to my daughter. I was redefining insults to protect her heart. And I realized, with a nausea that sat heavy in my stomach, that this was what my life would be if I did not sever the cord. I would spend the next 10 years translating their cruelty into kindness. I would be a filter, catching their toxicity before it hit her bloodstream. I could not live like that. I could not teach her to survive her family. I had to teach her how to leave it behind. I went back to the living room and picked up my phone. I reread the text from Maris. It was short, brutal, and exactly what I needed. She told me that I did not need to win them over with words. She said I just needed to stop asking. Stop asking for a seat. Stop asking for respect. Stop asking for love. You cannot negotiate with people who think they own the table. You have to buy the restaurant. I opened my laptop and pulled up the reservation confirmation again. I checked every detail. It was not booked under Lydia Ward. It was booked under the Northbridge Contract Integrity Office. That was my shield. That was the entity that signed my paychecks. The firm that companies like Ward Harbor Logistics feared more than the IRS. Table for two. 7 o'clock in the evening. The window seat. I stared at the screen. The window seat was crucial. It was the most visible spot in the Larkin ledger. It was the place where you sat if you wanted to be seen, or if you had nothing to hide. My father always sat in the back, in the private alcove, where deals could be made in hushed tones. I was putting myself in the light. I closed the laptop and walked to my closet. Usually, for a family birthday, I would agonize over what to wear. I would try to find something feminine but modest, something that said, I am a good daughter. I am harmless. Please like me. I would wear pastels. I would wear soft fabrics. I would dress like the background character they wanted me to be. Tonight, I pushed the dresses aside. I reached for the back of the closet, where I kept my work clothes. These were not the clothes of a daughter. These were the clothes of a senior auditor. I pulled out a charcoal blazer with sharp, structured shoulders. It was tailored to perfection. It was a piece of clothing that did not ask for permission. It announced a presence. I chose a silk blouse in a deep, slate blue, cold, professional, detached. I chose trousers that held a crease sharp enough to cut paper. I laid the outfit on the bed. It looked like a uniform for battle. I went to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were tired, but they were dry. For the first time in 30 years, I was not rehearsing an apology. I was not thinking about how to deflect Cameron's jokes or how to smile through Graham's dismissive comments. I was not wondering if I should bring a gift to smooth things over. I was not bringing a gift. I was bringing a file. It sat on my desk, a thick manila folder with a red tab. Inside were printouts, email chains, and financial discrepancies that I had uncovered during a routine compliance check on a port infrastructure project. It was dry, boring, factual data, but in the world of logistics, data is the only truth that matters. I ran my hand over the cover of the file. This was my leverage. This was the difference between a daughter begging for scraps and a professional demanding accountability. They thought I was coming to ruin a party with emotional outbursts. They thought I was coming to cry about being excluded. They were wrong. I was coming to work. I turned off the lights in the kitchen. The smell of bleach was still sharp in the air. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. It was the calm of a soldier who has stopped worrying about the war and started focusing on the mission. I was going to walk into that restaurant, and I was going to show Graham Ward the one thing he had never seen in me. I was going to show him a peer, and if he did not like what he saw, if he could not handle the reflection of his own ruthless ambitions staring back at him from across the room, that was no longer my problem. The dead end had opened up a highway, and I was driving straight through. The modern execution of a family exile does not happen with a dramatic reading of a will or a door slammed in a storm. It happens in the silence of a smartphone. It happens in the digital spaces where you cease to exist before you are even physically removed. My brother Cameron started the group chat 3 days before the dinner. I knew about it not because I was added, but because the silence on my own phone was so loud it was deafening. He named it something pretentious, likely the Ward Legacy Jubilee or Graham's 60th strategy. He added my father, he added Ethan, he added the wives, the cousins, and the select few business associates who were considered family adjacent. He curated the guest list like he was casting a play, and he deliberately, surgically, left me out. It was a masterclass in social chess. If he had blocked me, it would have looked aggressive. By simply starting a new thread without me, he made my exclusion look like a natural oversight, or worse, a mutual understanding that I did not belong in the winner's circle. Inside that digital room, I knew exactly what words were being thrown around. They love words like legacy and heirs and standards. They use them to dress up their cruelty in a tuxedo. They were likely discussing the seating chart, the vintage of the wine, and the tone of the evening, reinforcing the idea that this was a night for the victors. By not inviting me to the chat, Cameron was controlling the narrative. He was establishing a consensus. Lydia is out. Lydia is the past. We are the future. Then came the second wave, the management of the Lydia problem. Ethan was the first to break the line. Because Ethan cannot hold a hard line to save his life. His text came through while I was ironing my blazer. Hey Lyd, just a heads up. Dad is really stressed about the milestone. Maybe it is better if you sit this one out. I do not want you to get hurt. I looked at the screen and felt a cold, dull ache in my chest. It was not anger, it was pity. Ethan thought he was being kind. He thought he was protecting his big sister. But he was not protecting me. He was protecting his own comfort. He was terrified of Graham's temper. And he was willing to sacrifice my dignity to keep the peace. He was telling me to disappear so he would not have to watch me be erased. I do not want you to get hurt. Translation: I do not want to feel guilty while I watch them hurt you. I did not reply. A reply would have been an engagement, and I was done engaging on their terms. But the silence was busy. The rumors were already spreading, moving through the extended family network like a virus. My aunt called my cousin, who texted my old college roommate, who eventually circled back to me. The story Graham was spinning was brilliant in its malice. He was not saying he banned me. That would make him look like a tyrant. No, Graham Ward is smarter than that. He was telling people that I was unstable. He made calls to his key partners. The men who would be at the dinner. I could hear his voice in my head, pitch perfect in its faux concern. Lydia is going through a lot right now, he would say, lowering his voice to a confidential rumble. The adoption, it has been hard on her. She is fragile. She is very emotional. If she shows up, just be gentle. She might say things that do not make sense. It was a preemptive strike. He was painting a picture of a hysterical, unraveling woman. He was planting the suggestion of madness so that if I did show up and tried to speak the truth, everyone would view it through the lens he had crafted. Oh, poor Lydia. There she goes. Graham said she was losing it. He was weaponizing my motherhood against me. He was taking the most stable, grounded decision I had ever made, adopting Harper, and twisting it into proof of my mental decline. He was turning my strength into a symptom. That hurt more than the text message. It hurt more than the empty chair. The fact that they were constructing a fictional version of me, a sad, broken, dead-end woman, and getting the whole town to believe in her. They were holding a funeral for my reputation while I was still very much alive. I called Maris again, pacing the length of my living room. I told her about the rumors. I told her about Ethan's text. I told her I wanted to send a mass email attaching my mental health records and my bank statements just to prove I was sane and solvent. Maris laughed, a dry, sharp sound. "They are telling stories about you so they do not have to ask you," she said. "If they decide you are crazy, they do not have to listen to you. It is a defense mechanism. They are scared. Lydia, people do not build walls that high unless they are trying to keep out something dangerous." "I am not dangerous," I said. "You are tonight," she corrected. "You are the most dangerous thing in their world. A woman who stopped needing them." She was right. If I tried to correct the record over the phone or via text, I would look exactly like the frantic, desperate woman they described. I would be playing into their hands. I would be the drama they claimed to avoid. So I let the phone ring. I let the texts pile up. I let the rumors fester. I let them believe they had successfully managed the situation. I let Graham believe he had successfully quarantined the infection. I imagined them all getting dressed for the dinner, tying their ties and zipping their dresses, feeling smug and secure. Cameron would be high-fiving Ethan. Graham would be practicing his toast about family unity. They would be congratulating themselves on a problem solved. They were preparing for a coronation. They had no idea they were walking into a deposition. I looked at the clock. It was 6:30. I picked up the red folder. Inside was the truth. Not about my feelings, not about my childhood trauma, but about the one thing Graham worshipped: the business, the numbers, the cold, hard facts of a logistical operation that had gotten sloppy because the people running it were too busy patting themselves on the back to check the compliance logs. I did not need to win over the family. The family was a lost cause. I needed to win over the room. The Larkin Ledger is a theater. It is a place where people go to watch and be watched. Graham relied on that. He relied on the audience playing along with his script. But an audience is fickle. An audience does not care about the script. They care about the show. And I knew something Graham had forgotten. He thought his power came from his name. He thought it came from the fear he instilled in his sons. But in the world of high-stakes contracts and federal oversight, power comes from credibility. All I needed was one person of real consequence to see me, one person who mattered more to Graham than his own ego. If I could get one witness to look at me and see a professional instead of a dead end, the entire facade he had built would crack. I checked my reflection one last time. I did not look like a victim. I did not look like a daughter. I looked like an auditor arriving for a scheduled inspection. I walked out the door and into the cool evening air. I left my phone on the kitchen counter. I did not need it. I was done sending messages. I was about to deliver one in person. At 6 o'clock in the evening, two very different worlds were preparing for a reckoning. In the master suite of the Ward estate, my father stood before a full-length mirror, adjusting the knot of a silk tie that cost more than my first car. He was 60 years old today, and he was dressing not for a birthday, but for a coronation. He smoothed the lapels of a bespoke navy suit, checking for non-existent lint. He practiced his posture, pulling his shoulders back to occupy more space, to look like the patriarch he believed himself to be. He was rehearsing his speech. I knew the rhythm of it without being there. He would clear his throat, tap a spoon against a crystal glass, and speak about the sanctity of the Ward name. He would talk about the company as if it were a kingdom carved out of rock, and he would gesture to my brothers, Cameron and Ethan, calling them the pillars of his legacy. He would use phrases like unbroken line and men of vision. He would look at the 12 chairs arranged around the prime table at the Lark and Ledger and see a perfect circle, 12 seats, no gaps, no dead ends, just the heirs and the people who helped them shine. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in a small bungalow that smelled of rain and warm bread, I was boiling water. I was not pouring vintage wine. I was stirring powdered cheese into macaroni, the bright orange kind that Harper loved. The steam rose up and fogged the kitchen window, blurring the world outside. There was no speech to rehearse. There was no audience. There was just the rhythmic clink of a wooden spoon against the pot and the sound of Harper humming in the living room. This was my version of luxury. It was not gold-leafed or exclusive. It was the quiet, unpretentious peace of a home where no one had to audition for love. While Cameron was at the restaurant, likely bullying the sommelier about the aeration of the Cabernet and ensuring the 3-tier cake was positioned to catch the best lighting. I was folding pajamas. I smoothed out the small cotton shirts and the socks with the ruffled edges. I placed them in the drawer with a care that felt almost religious. I went into Harper's room to tuck her in. She was sitting up against the pillows, her eyes too alert for the hour. She watched me for a moment, her gaze tracking my movements as I straightened her duvet. Then she asked the question that had been sitting in the air between us like static electricity. She asked if Grandpa hated her. The room went still. I sat down on the edge of the bed. I wanted to lie. I wanted to tell her that he was just busy, or old, or confused. But I had promised myself I would not build our life on the same foundation of deceit that Graham Ward had built his. I brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. I told her that hate is a very big word. I told her that some people are terrified of things they cannot control. I told her that she is wild and wonderful and entirely her own person. And that kind of freedom scares people who only know how to live by rules they made up. She seemed to accept this. It was a logic she could grasp. She did not need to be loved by him. She just needed to understand why she was not seen. I kissed her forehead and turned off the lamp, leaving the nightlight to cast a soft, warm glow against the wall. As I walked back to the kitchen, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was the confirmation I had been waiting for. The screen displayed a name that would make the blood drain from Graham Ward's face. Nora Ellison. Nora was not a family friend. She was not a vengeful ex-wife or a scorned business partner. She was something far more dangerous. She was the regional director of the Port Authority Oversight Committee. She was the woman who decided which logistics companies kept their licenses and which ones were drowned in fines. She was not coming to dinner to help me enact a personal vendetta. She did not care about my father's birthday or his cruelty toward my daughter. She was coming because I had flagged a discrepancy in the shipping manifests related to the Northbridge infrastructure project. She was coming for a working dinner to review the preliminary audit of Ward Harbor Logistics. I was not bringing a weapon, I was bringing the law. I picked up the file. It felt heavy in my hand, dense with the specific gravity of truth. I put on the blazer I had ironed earlier. It was dark, sharp, and stripped of any softness. I pulled my hair back into a tight, low bun. I checked my reflection in the hallway mirror. There was no daughter looking back at me. There was only an auditor. I drove to the restaurant in silence. The city lights smeared past the window, streaks of red and white. I parked the car in the lot of the Lark and Ledger, but I did not get out immediately. I sat there for 5 minutes, gripping the steering wheel. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, bird-like rhythm. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe. In, out, in, out. It felt less like I was preparing for a dinner and more like I was scrubbing up for surgery. I was about to cut open the family dynamic and expose the rot to the air. I knew, with a sinking certainty, that my father would not change. Tonight would not end with a tearful reconciliation or a sudden acceptance of Harper. Men like Graham Ward do not change. They just harden. But that was not the goal. I was doing this for the ghost of the girl I used to be. the one who sat at the folding table and hoped for a crumb of attention. And I was doing it for Harper. I wanted to be able to look my daughter in the eye tomorrow morning and know that her mother did not bow. I wanted to know that when they tried to erase us, I did not just let them hold the eraser. I grabbed the pen. I opened the car door. The night air was cool and smelled of expensive perfume and valet exhaust. I smoothed the front of my blazer. I took the file in my left hand. I walked toward the entrance of the restaurant. The golden light spilled out onto the pavement, warm and inviting, masking the cold calculations happening inside. I stepped through the heavy double doors, moving from the shadows into the brilliance of the lobby. I felt a strange sensation as I crossed the threshold. It was the feeling of walking into a room where a lie was being told, knowing that I was the only one bringing the light. The coronation was about to be interrupted. The host led me to the table by the floor-to-ceiling window, the one that offers a panoramic view of the harbor lights, but also turns the diner into a display case for the rest of the room. It is the kind of table where you cannot hide a stained napkin, let alone a nervous tick. I sat down, facing the entrance, my back to the glass. I placed the red file on the white tablecloth. It looked violent against the pristine linen. A slash of warning in a room designed for comfort. Nora Ellison walked through the double doors at exactly 7 in the evening. She did not stride in like a woman who needed to prove she belonged. She walked with the efficient, terrifying quiet of someone who owns the building's mortgage. She was wearing a tweed jacket that had seen better decades and comfortable shoes. Yet the moment the floor manager saw her, his posture snapped straight. He practically vaulted over the host stand to greet her. That is the difference between my father and Nora. My father demands power by sucking the oxygen out of the room. Nora possesses power simply by occupying space. She shook my hand without smiling. Her grip was dry and firm. She sat down, ordered a sparkling water with a twist of lime, and nodded at the file. She asked if I had brought the breakdown analysis. I opened the folder. We did not exchange pleasantries about the weather or the appetizers. We went straight to the autopsy of a fraud. I walked her through the timeline of the Northbridge Port infrastructure project. I showed her the subcontracts for the retaining wall reinforcement. I pointed to the dates on the invoices from the concrete suppliers and compared them to the dates on the labor logs. I told her to look at the curing times. I explained that they were billing for rapid-set concrete pouring on days when the site logs showed heavy rain and 0 labor hours. I showed her the cash flow moving from the primary contractor to a shell company in Delaware, and then bouncing back to a consultancy firm that had no office and no employees, only a post office box 3 blocks from the Port Authority. Nora put on her reading glasses. She traced the line of numbers with a manicured finger. She was silent for a long time. In the restaurant industry, silence is usually a bad sign. In auditing, silence means you have found the vein. She looked up at me over the rim of her glasses. She told me that most junior auditors would have missed the rain delay discrepancy. She said they look at the totals, not the weather reports. I took a sip of my water. I told her that I do not believe in totals. I believe in the minutes. I told her that you can fake a ledger, but you cannot fake the weather. Nora closed the file, keeping her hand resting on top of it. She studied my face. It was an uncomfortable scrutiny, sharper than the lights overhead. She told me that I was a rare thing. She said most people shake when they are holding a knife to the throat of a king. She asked me if I knew whose throat I was cutting. I kept my face perfectly still. I knew exactly whose throat it was. It belonged to the man who had called my daughter a dead end 48 hours ago. But I did not say that. I did not want Nora to think I was a scorned daughter acting out a family tragedy. I wanted her to see me as a professional executing a duty. I told her I was just reading the numbers. I said the numbers do not have last names. Nora smiled then, a small, tight expression of approval. She told me that if this data held up to a secondary review, she would have grounds to suspend the primary contractor's license by tomorrow morning. She said the Port Authority does not tolerate padding, and they certainly do not tolerate phantom labor. She was talking about suspending Ward Harbor logistics. She was talking about putting a padlock on the gates of the empire my father claimed was eternal. I felt a surge of adrenaline. cold and electric. I was about to nod, to agree that the suspension was the only logical next step, when the acoustic atmosphere of the restaurant shifted. It happens every time the Ward family enters a room. The volume does not just go up. The frequency changes. It becomes performative. I heard the heavy, booming laugh first. It was a sound I had been trained to fear since I was 3 years old. It was the sound of Graham Ward announcing his arrival. I did not turn around. I did not have to. I could feel them behind me like a change in barometric pressure. I could hear the scrape of chairs as the staff rushed to accommodate a party of 12. I could hear Cameron's voice, loud and braying, making a joke about the valet parking. I could hear the clinking of jewelry and the murmur of the wives, the chorus of people whose entire identity relied on keeping Graham happy. For a split second, I was 12 years old again. I was the girl in the homemade dress standing at the edge of the patio, watching the adults toast to a future that did not include me. My stomach dropped. My hands, which had been steady while discussing millions of dollars in fraudulent invoices, started to tremble beneath the table. The instinct to hide was overwhelming. I wanted to slide under the tablecloth. I wanted to grab the file and run out the back exit into the safety of the dark. I looked at Nora. She had not turned around, but she had noticed my shift. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She was reading the sudden tension in my shoulders. I closed my eyes for a heartbeat. I saw Harper. I saw her in her pajamas, asking if she was a dead end. I saw the way she looked at me when I told her we were building a new road. If I ran now, if I let Graham Ward chase me out of this room without even seeing me, I was proving him right. I would be the unstable daughter. I would be the error. I would be the ghost. I took a breath. It was a shaky breath, but it was oxygen. I opened my eyes. I looked at the red file under Nora's hand. I looked at the window reflection where I could see the blur of the party being seated at the center banquette. I whispered to myself that I was not disappearing anymore. I picked up my water glass and took a drink. I set it down with a deliberate, audible click. I looked at Nora Ellison and asked her if she wanted to see the emails regarding the accelerated payment schedule. I was staying, and I was going to make sure that when the curtain fell on tonight's performance, I was the one holding the spotlight. The entrance of the Ward family was never just an arrival. It was a production. They moved through the double doors of the Lark and Ledger like a single, multi-headed organism designed to consume attention. My father led the phalanx, looking every inch the titan of industry he pretended to be. He was flanked by Cameron on his right and Ethan on his left, the visual shorthand for the line of succession he had spent 40 years curating. Behind them trailed the wives, the cousins, and the hangers-on, a chorus of 12 people who were all laughing a little too loudly at jokes that were not funny. They did not wait to be seated. They flowed toward the center banquette, as if the furniture had been arranged specifically for their comfort. Graham took the head of the table, the seat that commanded the best view of the room. Cameron sat immediately to his right, puffing out his chest, looking like a man who had just been handed the keys to the kingdom. Ethan took the left, already pouring wine before the napkins were even unfolded. It was the same tableau I had seen at every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, and every company gala for 3 decades, the holy trinity of Ward men in the center, and the rest of the world radiating out from their sun. I watched them from the reflection in the window. It was like watching a silent film where the actors are overacting because they do not realize the sound is off. The first domino fell about 30 seconds after they sat down. My cousin Dottie was the one who spotted me. She was reaching for a bread roll when her eyes drifted past Graham's shoulder and landed on the window table. Her hand froze in midair. She blinked. Once, twice, as if trying to clear a smudge from her contact lens. Then her mouth opened slightly. But no sound came out. It was the look of someone seeing a ghost in a place where ghosts are not supposed to be able to afford the cover charge. She nudged her husband. Wayne. Wayne looked. He stopped chewing. The silence started at the far end of their table and rippled upward, chair by chair, until it reached the throne. Graham, oblivious to the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure, stood up. He picked up his wineglass. a heavy crystal goblet filled with a vintage red that cost more than my first semester of college tuition. He was preparing to make the toast. I knew the speech. He was going to talk about legacy. He was going to talk about how a man is measured by the sons he leaves behind. He cleared his throat. A low rumble meant to silence the room. And then, he looked up. His gaze swept across the restaurant, soaking in the admiration he assumed was there. He looked past the waiters, past the other diners, and his eyes locked onto the window. He saw me. For a fraction of a second, his face registered pure, unadulterated annoyance. It was the look he gave a pothole in the driveway or a stain on his cuff. He looked ready to wave a hand and have me removed, like a piece of debris that had drifted into his frame. Then he saw who I was sitting with. I watched the blood drain from his face in real time. It started at his cheeks and washed down to his neck, leaving him pale and waxen under the restaurant's warm lighting. He did not just see a woman. He saw Nora Ellison. He saw the regional director of the Port Authority Oversight Committee. He saw the woman who signed the permits that allowed his trucks to enter the terminal. He saw the woman who had the power to freeze his assets with a single phone call. The glass in his hand wavered. A drop of red wine sloshed over the rim and stained the white tablecloth. A tiny, violent bloom of color. He looked from Nora to me, and then back to Nora. The math was happening behind his eyes, and the numbers were not adding up in his world. I was a dead end. I was a domestic failure. I was the daughter who made mac and cheese and wiped noses. I was not the woman sitting across from the most feared regulator in the logistics industry. Cameron followed his father's gaze. He squinted, confused. He leaned in and whispered something that carried across the sudden silence of the room. "No way. What is she doing over there?" It was the perfect question. It was the question that condemned them. It proved, in 5 words, that they did not know me. They did not know my job. They did not know my title. They did not know that the woman they had excluded from the group chat was the same woman who was currently holding their future in a red folder. Graham did not answer him. He set his glass down. He did not sit. He buttoned his jacket, a reflex of a man preparing for a fight, and he stepped away from the table. The walk from the center banquette to the window was only about 20 feet, but for Graham Ward, it must have felt like a mile across a minefield. I watched him approach. I saw him try to rearrange his face. He was scrubbing away the shock and trying to paint on a mask of benevolent paternal warmth. He was trying to pivot from the tyrant who texted heirs only to the loving father who was just delighted to see his daughter. It was a grotesque transformation. He was 5 feet away. He opened his mouth, likely to say my name, likely to try and claim me in front of Nora to save face. I did not let him speak. I stood up. I did not stand up aggressively. I did not knock my chair back. I rose with the slow, deliberate grace of a judge entering a courtroom. By standing, I forced him to stop. I forced him to look up at me, just slightly, because of the heels I was wearing. I established the physical boundary before he could cross the emotional one. I looked him dead in the eye. I did not smile. I did not flinch. I let him see the coldness in my face, a mirror of the coldness he had shown me for 30 years. But before the silence could stretch into awkwardness, Nora stood up too. She did not look at me. She looked straight at Graham. She extended her hand across the table, cutting off his path to me. It was a brilliant tactical move. By offering a handshake, she forced him to engage with her professionally. She stripped him of his role as a father and forced him into his role as a regulated entity. "Mr. Ward," she said. Her voice was smooth, pleasant, and absolutely lethal. I did not expect to run into the subject of our review so early in the evening. Graham froze. His hand, which had been reaching out as if to pat my shoulder, jerked back. He stared at Nora's outstretched hand. He looked like a schoolboy who had been called to the front of the class to explain why he had not done his homework. He took her hand. He had no choice. "Ms. Ellison," he stammered. His voice was thin. The booming baritone was gone. What a pleasant surprise. "I did not realize you knew my daughter." He stumbled over the word daughter, as if it were a foreign language he was trying to learn on the fly. Nora did not let go of his hand immediately. She held it for a second too long, a subtle display of dominance. "Oh, I know Lydia quite well," she said, releasing him. "She is one of the sharpest minds in contract integrity I have ever worked with. You must be very proud of the work she is doing on the Northbridge audit." The color that had drained from Graham's face came rushing back, but this time it was not the flush of power. It was the red heat of humiliation. He stood there, exposed in the center of the finest restaurant in the city, realizing that the dead end he had tried to cut off was actually the one holding the map. Graham tried to recover the fumble with the desperation of a man who sees his entire carefully constructed public image slipping off a cliff. He turned on that charm, the one he reserves for zoning board meetings and charity galas, and he gestured toward me with a hand that was trembling just enough to notice. He said that this was all a wonderful surprise. He said, "My daughter," putting a heavy, suffocating emphasis on the possessive pronoun, "has always been full of hidden talents." He tried to laugh, a hollow sound that bounced off the acoustic tiles. He said he was just telling everyone how much he missed me. It was a performance so disjointed from the reality of the last 48 hours that it felt like madness. The man who had texted me to stay away because I was a dead end was now standing in front of the most powerful regulator in the state. Claiming me as his beloved child, he was trying to use my body as a human shield against Nora Ellison. Nora did not blink. She did not smile back. She looked at him with the clinical detachment of a surgeon finding a tumor. She asked him, in a voice as calm as a weather report, if he was aware that his daughter was the lead author of the background report for the review happening tonight. The air left the room. Graham went still. His mouth remained slightly open, but the smile died instantly. He looked at me. Really looked at me. For the first time in years, he was not seeing his child. He was seeing the architect of his exposure. He realized in that second that while he was busy excluding me from group chats and dinner tables, I had been inside his ledgers. I watched Cameron, my brother, the heir, the golden boy, turn the color of wet ash. He set his wineglass down so hard the stem snapped, sending the bowl tipping onto the table, spilling a dark red stain that spread toward his plate. He did not move to clean it up. He just stared at the red file on my table as if it were a bomb. Ethan dropped his gaze to his lap. He looked like he wanted to dissolve into the floorboards. He knew. He had warned me not to come because he knew the house of cards was shaking. Even if he did not know I was the wind, the silence was thick, heavy, and excruciating. It was broken by Uncle Wayne, who had clearly had 2 martinis before arriving and possessed none of Graham's survival instincts. Wayne looked from Graham to me. Confused by the conflicting narratives, he blurted out that he did not understand. He said he heard Graham say just yesterday that Lydia was not stable. He said he thought I was having some kind of episode. Nora turned her head slowly to look at Wayne. It was a predator looking at prey. She asked, very quietly, "Who said that?" Wayne stammered. He looked at Graham for help, but Graham was staring at the wall, his jaw locked tight. Wayne realized too late that he had walked into a trap. If he pointed at Graham, he betrayed the patriarch. If he said nothing, he looked like a fool. Graham could not speak. If he admitted he started the rumor, he admitted to slandering a federal auditor to cover up a compliance failure. That alone would be enough to trigger an ethics investigation. So he stood there, mute, trapped in the web of his own lies. Nora turned back to Graham. She did not let the silence linger long enough to be comfortable. She reached into the red folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a printout of an email chain. She told Graham that in the dossier, there was a series of communications from the Ward Harbor logistics server. She said these emails were used to instruct subcontractors on how to inflate their labor hours to match the rain delays. She said it was a manual for fraud. She paused. The entire restaurant seemed to lean in. She said the sender of those emails was not a rogue employee. She said the sender was Cameron Ward. Cameron made a sound that was half gasp, half-choked sob. He shook his head violently. He started to speak, his voice high and thin, denying it instinctively. He said it was not him. He said someone must have used his login. He said he would never do that. Nora cut him off without raising her voice. She told him to stop. She said they had the authentication logs. She said they had the IP addresses. She said they had the digital fingerprints of every keystroke. She told him that lying to a federal auditor would only add a perjury charge to the fraud indictment. I looked at my father. I expected to see anger. I expected to see him explode at Cameron for being careless, for getting caught. But I did not see rage. I saw him shrink, for the first time in my life. Graham Ward looked small. His shoulders slumped. The expensive suit looked suddenly too big for him. He was looking at Cameron, his heir, the future of his name, and he was seeing the truth. He had bet his entire legacy on a son who was not just incompetent, but corrupt. He had spent 30 years pushing me aside, calling me a dead end, convinced that the only path forward was through his sons. And now, he was watching that path crumble. The empire was not under attack from the outside, it was rotting from the head down. He looked back at me. His eyes were wide, bewildered. He looked like a man waking up in a house he did not recognize. He saw the daughter he had thrown away standing tall, clean, and professional, holding the evidence of his failure in her hands. He saw that the competence he had worshipped was sitting right in front of him, but he had been too blinded by chromosomes to see it. I picked up my bag. I did not need to see the rest. The audit would happen. The fines would be levied. The suspension would be served. The law would take its course. And I would do my job with the same rigor I applied to every other case. But I had one thing left to say. I looked Graham Ward in the eye. I did not raise my voice. I did not let a single tremor enter my tone. I spoke clearly enough that the table of 12 could hear every syllable. I told him that I did not come here to ruin his birthday. I told him I came because I do my job, and I do it well. I told him that I also came to say one thing. I took a breath. I said, Harper is my daughter. She is not a mistake. She is not a charity case, and she is certainly not a dead end. I told him that anyone who refers to her as such is effectively removing themselves from my life. I told him that I choose who sits at my table, and he no longer had a reservation. I turned to Nora. I nodded once. She nodded back. A silent acknowledgement between equals. Then I walked out. I walked past the table where Cameron was weeping into his hands. I walked past Ethan, who was staring at me with something like awe. I walked past the cousins and the wives who were frozen in their seats. I walked out the door of the Lark and Ledger and into the cool night air. I did not look back. I did not need to. The building could have collapsed behind me, and I would not have flinched. I had walked in as a daughter seeking permission. I walked out as a mother who had just cleared the road for her child. Nora Ellison did not make a scene. She simply reached into her briefcase and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. She slid it across the white tablecloth until it rested next to my hand. It was not a lawsuit. It was an administrative order. It was a formal notice of the immediate suspension of contractor status for Ward Harbor Logistics, pending a full federal audit. It was the death knell for the Northbridge contract, and likely the beginning of the end for the way my father did business. I looked at the paper. The text was dense, standard legal boilerplate, but the meaning was clear. The empire was being put on pause. Nora produced a pen, a sleek silver instrument that looked heavy. She placed it on top of the envelope. I picked up the pen. My hand was steady. I expected to feel a surge of triumph, the kind of electric thrill that comes from finally landing a punch you have been holding back for 30 years. But there was no thrill. There was only a quiet, heavy sense of duty. Nora had already signed the order. All she needed from me was the acknowledgement that it had been served. I lowered the pen to the small receipt line at the bottom, the one that made it official that I had taken it into my hands. I signed my name. The scratch of the nib against the paper sounded loud in the hushed room. Graham watched me sign. He watched the ink dry. Then he turned his head slowly, painfully, to look at Cameron. For the first time in my life, I saw Graham look at his golden boy and see a stranger. He did not see the heir apparent. He saw liability. He asked Cameron, his voice barely a whisper, what he had done. Cameron panicked. The tears that had been threatening to fall finally spilled over, hot and pathetic. He pointed a shaking finger at me. He shouted that I was doing this on purpose. He screamed that I was jealous, that I was trying to ruin the family because I was bitter about being left out. He tried to turn the moment back into a family drama, a petty squabble between siblings, because that was a battlefield he understood. Nora cut him down with 3 words. She did not even look up from packing her bag. She said, "Do not." She said, "This is data." It was the ultimate dismissal. She was telling him that his emotions, his narrative, and his accusations were irrelevant against the weight of the forensic evidence. Then, from the left side of the table, a voice spoke up. It was a voice that rarely rose above a murmur. Ethan. Ethan was gripping his napkin so tight his knuckles were white. He looked at Graham, then at Cameron, and then he looked at me. There was a terrified bravery in his eyes. He told Graham the truth about the text message. He said that Cameron used Graham's email to send the heirs only notification. He said that Graham had read it and nodded. That is true. But the person who typed the words, the person who hit send, the person who made sure Lydia was cut out of the loop so she would not see the invoices was Cameron. The silence that followed was absolute. The twist was not that Cameron was cruel. We knew that. The twist was the realization that hit Graham Ward like a physical blow. He realized that he had not lost the project because I was vindictive. He lost it because he had handed blind, unchecked power to a son who knew exactly how to manipulate his father's prejudices. Cameron knew Graham viewed me as a dead end. Cameron knew Graham wanted a heirs-only kingdom. So Cameron used that bias to isolate me. Not because I was an embarrassment, but because I was the only one competent enough to catch him stealing. Graham had built a wall to keep me out, and in doing so, he had locked himself in with the arsonist. Graham looked at Cameron with a mixture of horror and revulsion. The legacy he had tried to protect was the very thing that had poisoned him. He looked back at me. His eyes were searching, perhaps looking for the daughter he used to dismiss, perhaps looking for forgiveness. I did not offer forgiveness. Forgiveness is earned, and he was overdrawn. I stood up and smoothed the cuffs of my blazer. I picked up my bag. I looked at the man who had spent 3 decades trying to decide if I was worth a seat at his table. I told him that I did not need to be invited to his table. I told him that I had my own table. I turned and walked away. The drive home was quiet. The city passed by in a blur of neon and streetlights. I kept waiting for the crash. I kept waiting for the guilt to set in, for the conditioned response of a daughter who had just dismantled her father's world to buckle my knees. But the crash never came. Instead, I felt light. I felt a physical sensation of weightlessness, as if I had been wearing a heavy winter coat in the middle of July for 30 years, sweating and suffocating under the weight of it, and I had finally taken it off. I walked into my house. It smelled of lavender and sleep. I went into Harper's room. She was curled up under her duvet, the nightlight casting long shadows on the wall. I kissed her cheek. She stirred and murmured something about school. I whispered that everything was okay. I whispered that the road was clear now. 3 weeks later, the letter arrived. It was not on company letterhead. It was not typed by a secretary. It was written on plain stationery in a handwriting that was shaky, less imperious than I remembered. There were no lawyers involved. There were no PR spins. Graham did not ask for the audit to be stopped. He knew that was impossible. He did not ask for me to fix the mess Cameron had made. He simply asked for time. He wrote that he would like to meet Harper. He asked for just 10 minutes, and at the bottom of the page, for the first time in his life, he wrote the words, "Your daughter and my granddaughter," without a single qualification. There was no mention of heirs. There was no mention of legacy. Just a grandfather asking to meet a child he had almost thrown away. I put the letter on the counter. That night, as I was helping Harper prepare her display board for the school science fair, She asked the question again. She was gluing a picture of a volcano onto the cardboard. She did not look up. She asked if Grandpa was coming to her science fair. I stopped what I was doing. I looked at my daughter, who was no longer a dead end, but the center of my entire map. I thought about the letter. I thought about the table at the Lark and Ledger. I thought about the boundaries I had built, not out of stone, but out of self-respect. I told her the truth. I said that if he knows how to respect you, then he will get to come. Harper smiled, satisfied, and went back to her volcano. I watched her, knowing that whatever happened next, whether Graham showed up or not, the cycle was broken. We were not waiting for permission to exist anymore. We were the main event. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey, and I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment down below and let's share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more revenge dramas and family sagas, please subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and support us by smash the like button so that this story can be heard by even more people.